Hi, my name's Jill Pilgrim, and I'm going to be interviewing Dr. Ann Pierson today. Thank you so much, Ann, for agreeing to do this, and it's Saturday, April 20th, 2024. So, Ann, can you start by telling us about who you are and how you came to live in Old Lyme?
You mean from the generations
Yes.
point of view?
Yes.
My house is the only brick house on Griswold Point, and it was built in 1822 by a collateral ancestor whose name was Captain Charles Griswold, and he was a sea captain, and that's why the house has a separate little room that is off the main part of the house, because he built that so that that could be his office. And he then had an outside door so the crew or suppliers could come in and transact business, but they were not to come in the main part of the house. So it was a farmhouse, and in the back it had a barn, as all the farmhouses did in those days. So when my grandparents came to own the house, this is William E.S. Griswold, and they had 6 children. And this was in about 1922, so it was about 100 years later. They decided to, well, she decided anyway, that the front hall, most federal houses had stairs that went up to the second floor from the entrance room. But she wanted an entrance hall, so they moved the stairs to further back into another room. And they decided also that they needed sleeping porches for their 6 children. So there were 3 children in one room, and these rooms were to be open. They had screens because it was considered that if you slept in fresh air that you wouldn't get tuberculosis. So that's where we came in, because when my mother owned the house, she decided we really didn't need screen porches, and so she enclosed those so that one has just sliding glass doors and the other one is like a regular room. So then in 1980 she gave me the property. So at that time, my parents were now living in California. So what my grandparents did, in addition to the screen porches, is they took down the barn and used the barn siding to create a guest house. And that's the interior of the guest house, is the barn siding. And on that footprint, they built a chauffeur's cottage. Such was life then. And at the back of the house, my grandmother added a wing that upstairs there were 5 bedrooms for the 5 maids. And downstairs, off what was now the kitchen and the butler's pantry, on the kitchen, coming from the kitchen, was a door going into the maid's dining room, which my grandmother had, and there were buttons in each of the front rooms, so if somebody wanted a maid, they just pushed the button, and there'd be a call box up at the top of the stairs in the maid's wing that would indicate by the arrow going up where pointing to the room that they were needed. So they built this chauffeur's cottage on that footprint, and then beyond that they built a little cottage which is now a white building, and that we call the squeeze box. And the squeeze box was where Louis Pulowski lived, and he was the handyman in that property. So the squeeze box, so-called, was because he also played the accordion. And that's how the name got attached to it. And then back of that, there was an ice house. According to my uncle, now I don't know because he said this, you could see where they hauled the ice, but I don't know. So that gives you an idea of what the property was. So because I listened a lot to WMNR, which is the Fine Arts Radio, I was asked to go to Woodbury for lunch, and it turns out it was Leroy Anderson's house. And I don't know whether you know that he was a wonderful composer of popular music in the 1930s. So I was there, and I noticed that his house was on the National Register. So I said, well, how does that happen? And they said, well, if you're interested, we would recommend Rachel Carley, because she's like a dog with a bone. And so she worked so long. I skip over some of the process of introducing this to the Griswold Point Association, of our cousins who started that. And at first people were a little hesitant, but I think finally we all pooled our money and paid for this consultant. She worked for over 3 years to gather all the information. She started with 9,000 BC, and I think there were some Indians that lived there. And so it goes all the way up to the present time. And I guess it was last year or so, first of all, we had to have the report approved by the historic commission in Hartford, and they approved of that. In fact, many of them commented that it was unique in that there was so much open space, because along the shoreline there's so many yacht clubs, beach clubs, many houses, but here there's a lot more open space. So once that was approved by the Historic Commission, then it was sent to Washington, and so we are now on the National Register. So that brings you up to this time.
How many houses are on that point?
There are about 19. And the house next door to me was Judge Griswold's house. And I think he was the first governor. And then his son was Roger Griswold, and I think the Elys now own that, and that's up on the rise. And then my uncle built a house out on Osprey Road, which is also on Griswold Point, and that's called Sea Cloud. And then there are other houses.
Do you know about how many acres?
I think it's about 200 acres that Griswold Point is.
Okay. Can you tell me about your growing up in Old Lyme? Did you grow up there?
I visited. I visited my grandparents.
Okay, so tell me.
Because I was living, I grew up mainly in Berkeley, California. And then my great-grandmother, that's a whole nother story, but my father was given the Woodbridge house in Salem, and his first name was Woodbridge. And so we would be there in the summer, and then we'd come from Salem to visit my grandparents, and most frequently it was Sunday lunch. And there was a time when I would sit next to my grandfather, and one time I looked down and my plate was gone. And he said, "Well, you're talking too much." And he had the plate on his lap. There's another occasion when my mother's youngest brother, Dwight Griswold, who became a doctor, he was trying to get the butler to smile, because butlers were not allowed to smile. But he would wait until he came into the dining room to serve people, and then he'd crack a joke, and he'd look to see if he could get the butler to smile. So we had fun at these lunches.
So how long did you come visit? I say in the summertime. Would you say how many years?
Ooh. Well, I've seen a photograph where I was like 2 or 3 years old, and I was walking on the front walk of the house I'm now living in. So I know we visited them over many years. But I guess it was when I was 7 that I remember being in the Woodbridge house and coming down to have lunch with my grandparents.
And so give me an idea about your, when you lived in California, how did you end up here? Like high school, college, that?
Well, when I was married and we had children, and he was working at St. Luke's Hospital, I had been to medical school, and I worked for Planned Parenthood for 20 years. And during that time, we were living in Englewood, New Jersey, and we would come and visit in the summertime. Then when my mother inherited the house, and the property, I should say, and she was still living in California, so she was only here in the summertime. I think she wanted to give me the property, so that I guess I moved into the house in about 1980, but it was in 1984 that I was given the property.
Okay. What made you decide to become a doctor?
Well, when I have to go back a ways, when my grandparents were in the house, and she had taught many of her children, or had made sure that her children played instruments. When she was in the brick house, she wanted to have an orchestra. So she asked around. She wanted to get more instruments because her children, could play some instruments, but she wanted more of an orchestra. So they said, somebody told her, you should ask the Bingham boys. So she contacted them, and some of them played the violin or the cello or whatever. And so they formed an orchestra, and they had a performance. And it was at that time that my father returned from China. He had graduated from Yale in 24 and had spent 2 years in China because he had majored in American history, and so he went to China to teach about American history, and then he became so interested in the Orient that he decided to come back and get further degrees in Oriental history. So he came back in 1926 when this orchestra was going to perform, and that's when my parents met, and that's how the Binghams became involved.
And so how did that make you want to become a doctor?
Oh, well, then when he got a fellowship, that they married, and I'm sort of skipping over years, but when he had a fellowship as part of working towards this PhD. One of the requirements was that he would go back and get more information about Oriental history. So we went over to China, and I was 5.5, and the next year I went to school by rickshaw to the Ming School, which had been founded by Chinese doctors who had trained in the United States. So they wanted their children to have the type of education that would make them qualified, that they would become qualified to have them be able to come to college in the United States. And there were, at that time, a lot of beggars, and they'd run after our rickshaw, and that's why I thought I would like to be able to help them. And also in China, the doctor, the pediatrician for us, was a woman. So the combination of knowing that women could become doctors, and the fact that that would be some way in which I could help with the health of those people, because by the time we left, which was about a year and a half later, the beggar who was outside our compound was blind, and he would use a tin cup to run after rickshaws. So that really, that made me concerned, and that's how. But also I had 2 uncles who had gone to medical school, so I knew it was doable.
And so during your childhood, what is a memory that stood out? One of like your best memory, a couple good memories?
One memory that I remember was that my grandmother had Cocker Spaniels, and one year she gave us a puppy, and we went back on. This was before we had transcontinental air flights. You did all your traveling by train, and so the puppy was put in the baggage compartment, and we would go and visit. But I also I was teaching him how to bring newspapers into the house, so I taught him how to go out and pick up the newspaper in his mouth and come back in the house. So I remember that it was fun.
Did you do a lot of other traveling? You talked about going to China. Did you do other traveling as a child with your family?
Well, from China, we went to Japan. So we were in Japan for 7 months. And we stayed in a missionary house. And my parents enjoyed chocolate. It had foil wrapping. And what we did was they put it together. They saved all the wrappings and had it in a big ball. And my sister and I took turns running down the street to put it in a box that was on a storefront. And at the time, I just remember that box on the top of it had a picture of a battleship. And it didn't register until years later when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. But when we came back to Berkeley, I remember also about once a month a ship would come from Japan and load up on, there was all this big pile of scrap iron, and they loaded up with scrap iron and took it back to Japan. And I don't think anyone had a clue that this is what they had in mind when Pearl Harbor occurred. As it was, there were only 5 people in the whole United States that knew how to speak Japanese when this all happened. So the Navy established a Japanese language school in Berkeley because there were a lot of Japanese that lived there. They were kitchen garden people and helping out. So that worked fine until my father decided to join the Navy and this Navy language school. Then the government sent out this edict saying any Japanese living on the West Coast, whether it was Washington State, Oregon, or California, must be moved. They have to go to Utah, Nevada, Colorado. So I was in school and we bade a sad farewell to the Japanese girl who was in our homeroom. And it wasn't until later that I realized that we were going to have to move too, because my father was at the Japanese language school. And so we all moved to Colorado for that winter until he graduated. Most of the students, the ones in the Navy that were getting this Japanese language school, were about 17, 18 years old. So they used to refer to my father as Grandpa. My father was only 41, but they called him Grandpa. So then, once he graduated and we went back to Berkeley, that's when he would leave every morning with a suitcase and go to wherever the Navy ships were. And he said, now, any time I don't come back, don't tell anybody, because I'll be going out on a convoy to Hawaii. Or he didn't even say where it was. He went to Hawaii. It's funny, there was one day when he didn't come back. So that was part of our experience with Second World War.
When did he come back?
Years later, because we would have an appointment to talk to him on the phone, and we were given like 5 minutes, and my mother would portion out things that we would say, so that we, each of us would have some subject that we would talk about. And then his letters were being censored, so we didn't know that he then was put on an LST, and he was the senior officer, so he became the chaplain in that LST, and he said it was so hot because it was a metal surface on the top and the sun beating down. It was really hot. But they were part of the invasion of Guam. This is all we learned later, obviously, but he was that group of, I guess he was being sent to be a translator, you see, of any prisoners. But they were in the second wave, the first wave with the Marines, to capture Guam. But they were all told, and my father included, that they should dig themselves a foxhole. Now I can no more imagine my father, a professor, digging himself a foxhole, but that's what he had to do. So when it became dark and he decided to get into the foxhole, he heard this rustling, and it came closer and closer, and he thought, I'm done for. This is obviously a sniper. And it came closer, and then he noticed it was a huge land crab that was making all this noise. And we learned all this later when he came home.
How old were you when this was all going on? Do you remember?
I guess by that time I was in junior high school. But it was very interesting because he did send us letters, but often they were censored. But one time there was what we would call a dollar bill, but it was from Manchuria, and it had a blood spot on it. And so this gave us a clue that he obviously was interviewing prisoners, Japanese prisoners. But otherwise, we didn't know what they were doing.
Okay. Do you want to tell me about when you met your husband?
When I went to college, I decided I was going to major in chemistry because I wanted to go to medical school. Because I'd always wanted to go to medical school, and in the summers I would bandage my cousins and put them in slings and that kind of thing. So then I discovered my roommate was having such a struggle with chemistry that I thought, no, that's not going to be for me. If I want to get into medical school, I don't think I'm going to do it. Well, I had volunteered at the Hartford Hospital in the summers when I was in the high school age. And what's I going to say? Well, I decided I really wanted to take care of people. I wanted to know something more about the people that I would be taking care of. So that's why I thought, well, I'm going to major in American culture, history, English, and sociology. So I understand Americans better. And that got me into medical school. But I think the main way I got into medical school was one summer. The 2 summers I was volunteering at the hospital, but the summer before I graduated, I went to Harvard and took organic chemistry. And that was sort of a watershed course. It really, we ate, slept, dreamt organic chemistry. But fortunately, that was the one course I was taking. But many Harvard students would take the lab course, the lab part of it, during the summer, and then take the lecture course in the winter. So, and that was because we would have 2 hours of lecture every morning, and we'd have 6 hours of lab in the afternoon, every day, for 8 weeks. So it was a tough course.
Is that how you met your husband?
So then I was accepted at medical school, and my mother wrote to me and said, I think they're the sons of two fellows who are in your class that are sons of friends of ours. And one of them was Richard Pierson. And he used to come in to class late, and he looked as if he'd slept in his clothes, and he had this bag that said Signet, which was advertising to everybody that his family had a sailboat. And I said, I said to myself, I'm not going to introduce myself to that fellow. And then the semester, that spring semester, we were given a list, it was single space, a tremendous list of topics that we could write a term paper on. And I looked at all of that and I said, no, I'm not interested in these. But I had received a flyer from a pharmaceutical company which was talking about intrauterine respiration. And I said, that's an interesting topic. I think I'd like to write about that. So I presented this idea to the professor, and he said, oh, that's fine. There's one other student who has also selected this, and we were only supposed to have 2 students write on any one topic. Well, that turned out to be Richard Pierson, and he said, oh, yeah. Well, if you're writing a term paper, I've been borrowing a lot of books from my father's library, and you're certainly welcome to use any of those books. And I thought, well, there goes my grade for this, because he obviously could. This would be much easier for him to write about. Well, it turns out that my father had dated his mother back when they were in college. And so she was very interested to know that I was in his class. And so I was invited to their birthday, and so the rest is history.
And so tell me about once you were married, and did you practice medicine? I mean, how did you make it all work?
Well, at first, you see, I was still in medical school. We married in 3rd year, between 3rd and 4th year. And then we sublet an apartment next to the dormitory where we were. And then we had internship. He was interning. He went to internship in St. Luke's Hospital, and I went to Lenox Hill Hospital, but we stayed with his parents in their apartment on 86th Street. Then that was year after medical school was the internship year, and I applied for residency because I wanted to go into OBGYN, and I was accepted at Cornell, and that was all fine until I was expecting. And so I went to the chief who had accepted me, and said, "I'm sorry, but I can't be a resident." And so that was sort of the end of my getting into a residency program. Then I think I try to remember. We did go to. He joined the Navy during the Korean War, and we went to Taiwan. And I worked at the Seventh-day Adventist Hospital, and anything that walked in, while I was taking, I was seeing patients in the surgeon's office while he was in this operating room. And so I would just work in the mornings. But that's how I started working. More just it was what we call now primary care.
Were you ever able to, during any of that time, bring your family back here in the summertime, or at any point to bring your family back here to Old Lyme to enjoy down at the house?
Well,
your property?
you see, because he was working at St. Luke's Hospital, we had a house in Englewood, New Jersey, and so in the summertime, I would come up with the children to Salem, and then we'd visit the grandparents in Old Lyme.
Okay.
That's a sort of simple answer.
Mm-hmm. And how did your children like coming up here?
Oh, I think they really enjoyed this. This was home, because it was either the Woodbridge house up in Salem, where we were, or and so my grandparents were still in the house where I'm now in, and we would visit them in the summer.
Okay. And when did you say you moved here? Would you say permanently, semi-permanently?
Well, in 1976, my mother said that I could use the back end of the house. She had divided the house because she found that she couldn't rent it, the whole house. Nobody wanted that for a vacation. You know, it was just too big. So there was somebody who was renting the back end of the house, and then they left, so my mother said, "Why don't you use that?" So I would come up with the children, and we'd stay in the back the other half of the house.
Mm-hmm.
And then in 1980, that's when she gave me the property.
And how long have you been here permanently?
I guess since about 1980.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then when did you start painting?
Probably 1983. I painted way back, because in grammar school we would go in the afternoon to Peggy Hayes' house, and she was remarkable in that anything we wanted to, if we wanted to do leather work, or we wanted to weave on a loom or do ceramics, then I learned years later that she was either the sister of or the daughter of a famous artist. I'm trying to think now, but not Chagall, but somebody else. Yeah, it'll come to me. But that's so we could do anything. She was so good at anything that was artistic, and then it was when we were up here, and I guess about 1983, I think, was when I started doing watercolors with Lou Bonamart. And when he'd give lessons at the Lyme Academy, or he'd go to Clinton, or Guildford, or New London, wherever he went, I would sign up for a class. So that's how I got going with the watercolor. And then I learned about, the fact that you could, if you had a painting that was framed, that you could enter it into, there were these various art societies, such as the Lyme Art Association, the Clinton Art Society, Madison Art Society, Mystic Art League, all of these. So that's how I got painting and framing, getting them framed.
Is there anything that I haven't asked you? What would you like to tell us that I haven't asked you? Maybe about your family history?
Well, it's just interesting that the two families got together. I mean, the Griswolds and the Binghams, and I found very interesting to learn more about the Binghams, because my grandfather was the one who discovered Machu Picchu, and also my great-grandmother I was named after. She was the daughter of Charles Tiffany, and he had two daughters, and so Annie Olivia Tiffany became a Mitchell, and she wanted very much to have boys, but instead she had two daughters. So one daughter she named Charlie, after her father, and the other one she named Alfreda, after her husband. Well, Charlie ended up having a daughter, and that, my great-grandmother was not happy about that. But Alfreda ended up having 7 sons. And so that really, she was so thrilled that this daughter had all these sons, that she gave them farms up in Salem. And most of the 7 sons were given first names that were last names, like Brewster, Mitchell, and Woodbridge, and so my father was Woodbridge, so she gave him the Woodbridge farm. And that's how we were living in the Woodbridge house in the summers, and visited here in Old Lyme. So then the next son had 11 children, but that's the Harry Binghams.
Do you ever have family reunions?
Yeah, well, there we have something called the Salem Valley Corporation, and because all these cousins own farms there in Salem. So that's one reason. But also in Black Hall, we have this Griswold Point Association. And for a time, I was president of the Black Hall Association, which had been formed to just make sure we, I don't know, keep the idea of keeping it the way it was.
Okay. Anything else?
Well, I can't think of what,
All right. Thank you very much.
Well, you're
And
welcome.
Thank you. That was wonderful.